The year is 1942, and across Europe, various German concentration camps have been established. Most of these are slave labor facilities, where Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and the mentally retarded, and various other undesirables are forced to work on behalf of the Reich. A few, though, have a much darker, more sinister purpose. These don't have factories, mines, or quarries to be worked, and in fact only exist for one purpose: mass murder on an industrial scale. No different than cattle to the slaughter, over 6 million people are herded into gas chambers and killed. The guards overseeing one of the worst crimes against humanity in history, simply going about their job like it was a regular 9 to 5. But why did tens of thousands of German guards just idly obey commands to help kill millions of people? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're taking a look at the infamous Stanley Milgram psychological study that proved people were perfectly willing to obey orders and shock others to death. When World War II ended, many former Nazis found themselves dragged up before international tribunals to answer for their heinous war crimes. Time and again, the men and women on trial offered a single excuse: "I was just following orders." They didn't deny the knowledge of what their actions were helping facilitate, and they didn't sugarcoat what they did. They simply excused their part in one of the greatest genocides in history by simply saying, "I was told to." The former Allies weren't buying any of this blind obedience, and many Nazis found themselves imprisoned or hung on the gallows for their crimes. But in 1961, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram grew curious about just how much a role obedience had in the execution of these heinous crimes. After all, no matter the racial prejudice, it was extremely unlikely that any one of the men and women involved would have personally murdered a concentration camp prisoner. If this were true, then our streets every day would be running in rivers of blood. And yet society continues to function relatively well, and rather than minorities being executed, they see their social and legal status continually improved in liberal democracies around the world. Why this paradox then? Why were these thousands of Nazis perfectly normal and law-abiding citizens before the war, but then turned into mass murderers during the war? Could simple obedience really be the difference between genocide and peaceful cohabitation? To help answer this question, Milgram developed an experiment at Yale University and put out an advertisement in the local newspaper asking for male participants. Each participant would be paired with another person, secretly an accomplice of Milgram's, that was pretending to be just another normal participant. The real participant would take on the role of teacher, and the accomplice would take on the role of learner. Although to mask the deception, lots were drawn to determine roles. Naturally, the draw was always fixed to ensure the accomplice was the learner. In all, the experiment drew 40 males aged between 20 and 50, and whose jobs ranged from unskilled to professional. The wide variety of test subjects would prove vital in determining if there was a difference in age or profession as far as obedience to authority was concerned. As the experiment began, the learner would be taken into a separate room and have electrodes strapped to their body, with a thin wall separating the accomplice learner from the teacher who was seated directly on the other side of it. The learner was then given a list of word pairs to learn, and the teacher was asked to test the learner by naming a word and asking the learner to recall its partner from a list of 4 choices. The learner, as an accomplice, purposefully picked the wrong word most of the time, which prompted the experimenter to deliver an electric shock every time that the learner made a mistake. Each time the shock was delivered, though, the voltage was increased, so that the next shock would be more painful. The punishment shocks began at 15 volts, or a particularly strong static shock, to 450 volts, a voltage lethal enough to kill if its path were to cross the heart. As the experiment continued, the learner would keep giving wrong answers, and the teacher was prompted to deliver a fresh shock. On the other side of the wall from the learner, all the teacher heard was the shouts of pain from the learner, and as the shocks grew in intensity, the learner would begin to plead to please not be shocked again, or to be let go from the experiment. The worse the shocks got, the more pleading and begging, and the louder the screams of pain became. When the teacher started balking at delivering another shock, they would be given exactly 4 prods to continue the experiment. The first being, "Please continue." If the teacher still refused, then they would be told, "The experiment requires you to continue." If that was still not enough, then they would be told, "It's absolutely essential that you continue." Finally, if that didn't work, then they would be told, "You have no other choice but to continue." After the 4th prodding, if the teacher refused to keep going, then they would not be asked again and the experiment would end. Each response was carefully crafted to slowly increase the level of authority projected onto the participant, until at last making that authority absolute. It's important to note that the participants were not restrained or under any legal obligation to continue the experiment and could have quit at any time. The result of the experiments were shocking, pun fully intended. Of the 40 individuals who took part, a full 2/3 of them continued the experiment to the highest power level, 450 volts. This is despite the learner on the other side of the wall begging for the experiment to stop, crying and sobbing and screaming in agony. The other third refused to continue the experiment, though they all made it at least 3/4 of the way through, hitting at minimum 300 volts. Milgram's experiments discovered something truly terrifying about humanity. As he said himself, stark authority was pitted against the participants' strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and with the participants' ears ringing with the screams of his victims, authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study, and the fact most urgently demanding explanation. Milgram would go on to explain the behavior exhibited in his experiment and at Nazi death camps across Europe by suggesting that every day people have two distinct states of behavior when in social situations. The autonomous state is where people direct their own actions and take responsibility for those actions. The agentic state is when people allow others to direct their actions and then pass off the consequences of those actions to the person giving the orders. They are happy to act as agents of the other's will, but don't believe that they themselves bear the responsibility for the consequences. Known as the agent theory, Milgram suggested that in order for a person to enter the agentic state, two things must be in place. The person giving the orders must be perceived as being qualified to direct the other people's behavior. In other words, the person giving the orders must be a valid form of authority, and the person being ordered must be able to believe that the authority giving the orders will end up accepting responsibility for what happens. The second point was brought to light as the experiment progressed to higher and higher shocks. Here, some participants were told that they had responsibility for their own actions, meaning that any harm they were doing to the other individual and the consequences of that harm would be on their own heads. These individuals showed the highest rate of refusal to continue the experiment, with very few continuing to obey. Others were told that the responsibility for any harm being done to the individual would fall directly on the organizers of the experiment, and of these participants, they showed the highest willingness to continue to obey. Some who balked at continuing even changed their mind and went on after being told they wouldn't be responsible for what happened. Milgram would go on to conduct the experiment again in 18 studies with a variety of different factors in each. In one experiment, the experimenter or the individual ordering the electric shocks would wear a gray lab coat, a symbol of authority and a kind of uniform. Then the experimenter would be called out of the room because of a phone call right as the experiment began, and he would be replaced by another individual dressed as an ordinary member of the public. In this experiment, the obedience level dropped from over 65% to just 20%. In another variation, Milgram changed the location of the experiment to a set of rundown offices instead of the very impressive and prestigious Yale University. Here, despite the experiment remaining exactly the same as in Yale, obedience dropped to 47.5%. This suggested that the environment or the status of the location also affects obedience, lending credence to the theory that authority is perceived more than it is learned. In a third variation, the participants could tell an assistant who was also in on the experiment to do the shocking for them, rather than doing it themselves. Incredibly, this changed obedience rate to a whopping 92.5%, proving that as there's less personal responsibility, obedience to authority, even if immoral, increases exponentially. In a fourth variation, the participant had to physically force the learner's hands down onto the shock plate once the learner began to refuse to take part after reaching 150 volts. Not surprisingly, this plummeted obedience to just 30%, proving that when the participant was not buffered or protected from seeing the consequence of their actions, many would not choose to continue obeying. In a fifth variation, the participant was joined by two other teachers who were also in on the experiment. One of the fake teachers would refuse to participate at 150 volts, and the second would choose to stop at 210 volts. When the real participant saw others disobeying an authority figure, obedience dropped to just 10%. In a sixth variation, the experimenter was not physically in the room with the participant and instead relayed his instructions via telephone. When the experimenter instructed the participant to deliver an electric shock, but the participant was not physically in the room with the authority figure, obedience rates fell to 20.5%. Interestingly, when not directly observed, many of the participants actually cheated. and purposefully missed giving electric shocks or gave far less voltage than they had been ordered to. This proves that proximity to an authority figure affects obedience. While Milgram's study revealed a shocking disposition to obey authority, even when immoral, there was heavy criticism aimed at it by other psychologists. One set of criticism alleged that the participants may not have fully believed the experimental setup and did not believe the learner was actually receiving electric shocks. There were also problems with the sample group used, as all the participants were male, which begs the question if females would act differently. Future studies involving females would disprove the notion that there's any major difference in obedience to authority between men and women. However, another critical flaw in the study is that the entire sample population was self-selected, or in other words, they had volunteered themselves for the study. This may point to them having more of a volunteer personality, which might directly affect how they react to authority figures overseeing their behavior in a study that they themselves wanted to be a part of. The Milgram study has been plagued with controversy almost since its inception, yet seeing the pattern of genocide and mass atrocities committed by both soldiers and everyday men and women across history, there can't be any denying the underlying finding. We humans are disturbingly prone to obeying even immoral authority, as long as we can plausibly shift the blame from ourselves to an authority figure. It's okay if you round up all the Jews in your city and march them to a concentration camp, because in truth it's not really you doing it, but the system that you're just a small part of. Even the guilt of mass murder can be easily discarded, or rather shifted from the self to those giving orders. Perhaps then the legal defense offered by thousands of Nazis that they were just following orders should have been a valid one after all. And we can't help but wonder just how much of a push do we ourselves need to turn from law-abiding citizen to a facilitator of mass murder. Would you have obeyed orders to shock an innocent person? Why or why not? Also, make sure you check out our other video, Would You Survive the Stanford Prison Experiment? And as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because we told you to. Do it!